Mark sat at his desk, staring at the stacks of paperwork that had taken over his life. The hum of his computer was the only sound in the office. It had been hours since he last checked his phone. His mind was focused on the next big project. Another day in the life of a successful corporate worker. At least, that's what he told himself every time he woke up. But tonight, as the clock ticked away, something felt different. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something in his life was slipping away. He'd been working late more often, and Lynn, his wife, had been distant for weeks now. At first, he thought it was just stress, the constant grind. But tonight, something felt off. He hadn't seen Lynn in days except for fleeting moments when they passed each other in the kitchen. Their routine had become colder, their conversations more mechanical. He thought back to the beginning of their relationship, the long talks over coffee, the lazy Sunday mornings, the laughter. They had been in love. He'd put her on a pedestal, thinking that nothing could tear them apart. But now, as he sat in the silence of his office, he felt the weight of her absence more than ever. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at his phone screen. No new messages, no missed calls. He clicked on a few old text threads, memories of their earlier days together. Lynn had always been the one to reach out, to ask about his day, to send random messages of love. That had stopped a while ago. Now it was all just quiet. The phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text from Lynn. He opened it without thinking. "I'll be home late tonight. Don't wait up." He frowned. There was no reason for that kind of message. She had never been this detached, this formal. It wasn't like her. Mark glanced at the clock. It was already past 9. Lynn hadn't been home for dinner and she hadn't called. She'd never been this careless about their schedule before. Something was wrong, and he could feel it in his bones. He stood up, pacing around the room. His thoughts raced. Was it just the pressures of life, or was it something deeper? Something he couldn't see but could feel slipping through his fingers. He thought about all the late nights she'd been spending at the gym or with friends, but no one ever seemed to know where she was. It had all become a blur. Mark couldn't ignore the pit in his stomach any longer. He needed to know. He had to find out what was going on, even if it meant facing something that might shatter everything. But how? How had they gotten here? And why hadn't he noticed sooner? He picked up his phone again, typing in Lynn's name. His fingers hovered over the screen. His heart raced. His hand trembled slightly, betraying his calm exterior, but he couldn't turn back now, not after everything that had happened, not after the way things had changed. He pressed send on a message. Simple, direct. "Where are you?" The minutes that followed felt like hours. His mind wandered, playing out every possible scenario, the worst-case scenario, the one he didn't want to face. Lynn's reply came swiftly. "I'm out with friends. Relax." But something in the tone of her words didn't sit right with him. There was no warmth, no affection. Just a cold, detached response. Something didn't add up. Mark exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. He had to trust his instincts. He couldn't keep ignoring the truth any longer. He walked to the window and looked out into the night. His reflection stared back at him, a man trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, something that was slipping faster than he ever imagined. He ran his hand through his hair, feeling the tightness in his chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a phase. He was losing her. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, was becoming a stranger to him. And deep down, Mark knew something else. This wasn't just about a wife being distant. This was something far darker, something far more dangerous. As the darkness outside pressed against the glass, Mark felt his own heart growing colder. Lynn sat in the dimly lit corner of the cafe, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. The heat from the cup didn't seem to reach her, and her mind was far away, lost in the thoughts that had consumed her for weeks. The table in front of her was littered with scribbled notes, numbers, names, and strange calculations that now seemed to hold more weight than her family's well-being. Brian was late. That had become a familiar pattern over the past few weeks, him showing up just before she was ready to leave, pulling her back into the whirlwind they'd created. Every time they met, she felt herself slipping further from her reality, from Mark, from everything that once mattered. Her heart raced, not from excitement, but from fear. Fear of being found out, fear of what she was about to do. The bell above the door chimed, and Brian walked in. His smile was as disarming as ever, his presence magnetic. Lynn felt the familiar pull of his attention as he slid into the seat across from her. "You've been waiting long?" he asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. "No," she lied. She wasn't waiting for him. She was waiting for the right moment, the moment when she could break free. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice low, almost imperceptible. Brian's eyes flickered, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he pulled out his phone and slid it across the table toward her. There, on the screen, was the photo of Ray, the man who would make everything disappear. "Ray's ready," Brian said, his voice taking on an almost casual tone. But Lynn could hear the edge beneath it, the edge that told her just how serious this had become. "He'll do the job for the right price. Everything you've wanted. All you need is to commit. No turning back after this." Lynn's hands trembled, but she couldn't let him see it. She needed to stay composed. If she let her nerves show, if she faltered now, there was no going back. "I'm ready," she said quietly, staring at the image of the man who would end Mark's life. "How soon can we move?" Brian leaned back in his chair, a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "Tonight." The word hung in the air between them, thick with finality. Lynn's breath caught. Tonight. She had told herself she wasn't sure. She had told herself that maybe she could just walk away. But now that it was real, she felt her resolve solidify. For a moment, the world around her seemed to stop. She could hear her heartbeat thudding in her ears, could feel the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest. This wasn't a decision she could undo. This would change everything. "I'll need the money," she said, her voice colder than she intended. She didn't care anymore about the love she had once felt for Mark. It had eroded over time, replaced by resentment and loneliness. And now there was nothing left but the promise of freedom. Brian slid a small envelope across the table. Lynn took it, feeling the heavy weight of it in her hands. She looked at the contents, cash, more than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to start a new life, to disappear. "Just make sure you don't get caught," Brian said, his voice suddenly hard. "Once it's done, you need to keep your story straight. We can't afford mistakes." Lynn nodded, slipping the envelope into her bag. The plan was set. Mark was as good as dead. It was only a matter of time before she would finally be free, living the life she had always dreamed of. As Brian left, a lingering sense of dread washed over her, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. This was her choice. She was in control now. The thought echoed in her mind as she left the cafe. She was in control. But as she walked into the cold night, something gnawed at her from the inside. The part of her that once loved Mark, the part of her that had built a life with him, was screaming in silence. But she pushed it down, forcing herself to stay focused. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. Mark sat in his car, staring at the dimly lit house ahead. It felt like the weight of the world was pressing against his chest. Lynn had been gone for hours again, and he couldn't ignore the growing unease that had plagued him for weeks. Something was wrong. His gut told him that this was more than just a rough patch in their marriage. He knew it. The private investigator's findings had confirmed what he had feared, and now, with everything laid bare in front of him, he couldn't help but feel betrayed to his core. He had always believed in their love, their bond, but now it was all slipping away. The investigator had followed Lynn, collecting photos and evidence of her meetings with Brian, evidence Mark could no longer deny. But there was more. The investigator had found out that Lynn was seeing someone else, a man named Ray, someone Mark had never heard of before. And that was where the fear started to crystallize. Ray was no ordinary man. He was dangerous, someone who had done things for money, someone Mark couldn't even begin to understand. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel as he stared at the house. He had no idea what was coming next, but he couldn't just sit idly by. He needed answers, and he was ready to confront Lynn. He was ready to face whatever it was that she had been hiding from him. He pushed the door open and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his skin. Every step felt heavier than the last as he approached the front door. He had to know. He had to confront her. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Not when everything inside him was screaming that it wasn't. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. He walked through the familiar hallway, each step echoing louder than the last. He entered the living room and saw the empty space where she used to sit, where they used to talk about their days. The silence in the house was suffocating. He felt like a stranger in his own home. Mark had always trusted Lynn, but now everything he thought he knew was unraveling before him. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages the investigator had sent him. He reread the texts and the photographs, the proof of Lynn's betrayal. His heart ached, but his anger soon overshadowed the hurt. How could she do this to him? After everything they'd been through, after all the years they had spent together. The door opened behind him. Lynn stepped inside, her face lighting up when she saw him. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mark, you're home early," she said, her voice steady, too steady. He turned to face her, holding her gaze. He couldn't look away, not now. "I need to talk to you." Lynn paused, her expression flickering for a moment before she regained control. "About what?" she asked, stepping further into the room. "You know exactly what," Mark replied, his voice low. "The affair, the lies, the betrayal." His words hit the air like a slap, the truth finally breaking free after weeks of turmoil. Lynn froze, her eyes widening, but she quickly recovered, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Mark, don't lie to me," he interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "I know about Brian, I know about Ray, I know everything." Lynn's face turned pale, the color draining from her cheeks. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. Mark could see it in her eyes, the guilt, the fear. It was all laid bare in that moment. And for the first time, he saw her not as the woman he loved, but as a stranger. "Mark, I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for it to go this far." Mark clenched his fists, trying to control the surge of anger that threatened to consume him. "You hired a hitman, Lynn. You planned to have me killed." The words felt foreign in his mouth, almost too surreal to believe, but they were true. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his life, had plotted his death. Lynn took a shaky breath, her eyes darting around the room. I didn't know how else to get out," she murmured, almost to herself. "I didn't know how else to escape. Escape from him, from the life they had built." Mark's chest tightened. The pain of her words hit harder than anything he had imagined. She had been planning this for months, and now he was standing here, confronting her with the truth of it all. "Why?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy? Why didn't you talk to me?" Tears welled up in Lynn's eyes, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she just looked at him, as if the weight of her actions had finally sunk in. Mark felt like the ground was falling away beneath him. His life, his love, his everything, shattered in an instant. He had never imagined it could end like this. "Why, Lynn?" he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "Why did it come to this?" Lynn didn't answer. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with the weight of what she had done. And in that moment, Mark realized something. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything they had built together, the trust, the love, the family. And all of it had been taken away in a matter of seconds. Mark stood there, the silence between him and Lynn thick enough to choke him. The truth hung in the air, its weight unbearable. He had never imagined it would come to this. His wife, the woman he had loved for years, standing before him, the orchestrator of his demise. And yet here she was, the evidence undeniable, her face pale and stricken with guilt. "I didn't know how to leave," Lynn whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want this to happen." Mark's heart cracked at the words. He wanted to scream at her, to shout, to make her feel the depth of his pain. But instead his voice came out low, broken. "How could you do this to me? How could you plan something like this?" Lynn recoiled slightly at the force of his words, her shoulders shaking. But she didn't look away from him. Her eyes, wide and full of tears, spoke volumes. She had already lost her defenses, standing there before him, exposed in the worst way imaginable. "I was lost," she choked out, taking a step back. "You were never here, Mark. You were always working, always focused on everything else but me, but us." Mark's chest tightened. He could feel his breath quicken as the anger rose within him. How many times had he heard her say this before? How many times had he tried to make it right? And yet, here she was, justifying her actions with empty words. She had made a choice. She had made it long before this moment, and now there was no going back. "Is that what this was about?" he asked, his voice rising. "You couldn't talk to me? You couldn't come to me with your feelings? You couldn't even try? And instead you made the choice to betray me? To end my life? Everything we had together, our family, was worth so little to you?" Lynn's eyes filled with more tears. She wiped at her face, trying to keep them from falling. "I never wanted to hurt you. I swear to God, Mark, I never did." "Then why?" His voice cracked as he asked the question he already knew the answer to. "Why did you do it? Why did you bring someone else into our lives? Why did you think I wouldn't find out? What did you think would happen?" Lynn fell silent, her lips trembling. For a moment, the only sound in the room was their ragged breathing. Mark could feel the pain in his chest, the overwhelming ache that threatened to crush him, but he couldn't look away. He couldn't let her off the hook, not this time. "I was lonely," Lynn finally confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I felt invisible. I needed someone to see me, to want me. I didn't know how to fix it. And then Brian came along and I thought, maybe this would be my way out. I thought I could be happy again. But I was wrong. I know that now." Her confession hit him like a punch to the gut. The loneliness he had heard about, the emptiness she had felt were real, but they were no excuse. She had made her choice, and now it was too late for apologies. He wanted to hate her, wanted to scream at her, but instead he just felt hollow, empty, like everything he had known had just been a lie. "You didn't just hurt me," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You hurt our kids. You hurt us, Lynn. Everything we built is gone, and for what? For what?" Lynn didn't answer. She couldn't. The weight of her actions was too much. She stood there, frozen, her face crumpled with regret and shame. Mark could see it in her eyes now, the same regret he had felt when he first found out about the affair. But it was too late for regret, too late for apologies. Mark clenched his fists, his body trembling with fury. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel anymore. His anger, his betrayal, his heartbreak, they all fused into something dark and consuming. But as much as he wanted to lash out, to make her feel the hurt she had caused, he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Not until he had all the answers. "You don't get to make excuses for what you did," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You don't get to walk away from this. Not like this." Lynn nodded slowly, her body shaking. She had no words left, nothing to say that could change what had already been done. And Mark knew there was nothing more to say. She had made her choice. Now it was time for him to make his. "I need to think," Mark finally said, his words heavy with finality. "I need to figure out what comes next. But you're done, Lynn. You've ruined everything, and I can't—" He stopped, his throat tightening. He couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of losing everything, his family, his life, his love, was too much to bear. Lynn stood there, her hands at her sides, as Mark turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the house, through their broken marriage. Mark didn't look back. He couldn't, not now, not when everything had already been shattered. The air felt thick with anticipation as Mark sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the incriminating photos once again. Lynn's betrayal, her affair with Brian, and the chilling revelation that she had hired Ray to kill him, each piece of evidence was a dagger to his heart, yet somehow the truth gave him clarity. There was no turning back. He couldn't let her destroy everything they had built, everything he had worked for. He had to act, and he had to act fast. Mark stood up from his desk, the weight of the situation pressing on his chest. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Lynn thought she had everything under control, but she was wrong. She had underestimated him. The hidden cameras were already in place. His private investigator had done his part, gathering all the evidence needed to expose Lynn and bring Ray into the light. The trap was set, and Mark wasn't going to let her slip through his fingers again. His phone buzzed. It was Lynn. "I'll be home late again tonight. Don't wait up." Mark stared at the message for a long moment, his heart thudding in his chest. She thought she was so clever, so in control. But he had her now. He had everything he needed to stop her. All he had to do was wait for the right moment. He walked over to the window, looking out at the dark street. The house felt empty, silent, like the calm before the storm. His mind raced with what he had to do next. Confronting Lynn tonight wasn't just about stopping her from carrying out her plan. It was about taking back control of his life. He had let her manipulate him for far too long, and now it was his turn to dictate the terms. As the hours passed, the house grew darker, the shadows creeping into every corner. Mark's thoughts were consumed by what was about to unfold. Would Lynn be surprised? Would she try to deny it all again? Or would she finally crack under the weight of her lies? The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Mark's pulse quickened. She was home. He waited, still, his body tense, as Lynn's footsteps echoed down the hallway. He could hear her voice, light, casual, as if nothing had changed, as if she didn't just try to destroy him. "Mark?" Her voice called out, slightly tentative, yet still confident. "Are you home?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood motionless, watching the shadows on the walls, listening to the sound of her footsteps drawing closer. He could feel his heart pounding, the anger and pain building inside him. He had never wanted to confront her like this, but she had left him with no choice. Lynn appeared in the doorway, her expression softening when she saw him standing there. "I didn't think you'd still be up," she said with a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Mark finally turned to face her. His eyes locked onto hers, steady, unwavering. He had to make her understand just how much she had hurt him, how much her betrayal had broken him. "You need to stop lying to me, Lynn," he said, his voice cold but filled with an intensity that made her pause. Lynn froze, a flicker of something, fear maybe, crossing her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mark held up a hand, silencing her. "I know everything," he said, his words cutting through the silence. "I know about Brian. I know about Ray. I know you were planning to have me killed." Lynn's face drained of color. She took a step back, her eyes widening in shock. Mark saw the briefest flash of panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "Mark, you don't understand," she began, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Don't lie to me," he spat, his voice rising. "You planned it. You hired Ray to kill me, to end everything we had. Don't you dare try to tell me you didn't mean it. You made your choice." Lynn's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't move. "I didn't know what else to do," she cried. "I felt trapped. I couldn't live like that anymore, always second to your job, always alone." Mark's heart ached as her words hit him. But it wasn't enough. The pain she had caused, the lies she had told. It wasn't something he could forgive so easily. Not anymore. "Do you really think that justifies what you did?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You wanted a way out, so you decided that I didn't deserve to live? How could you do that to me?" Lynn trembled, her hands shaking as she wiped the tears away. "I'm sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I was lost. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix us." Mark stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was sorry, but it didn't change what she had done. He could feel his anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he couldn't let it consume him. Not yet. "You can't take back what you've done," he said, his voice hard. "You can't just apologize and think everything will be okay. You're done, Lynn. You've ruined everything." Her tears flowed freely now, but Mark didn't move. He stood there, feeling the finality of it all. Lynn had made her choice, and now it was time for him to make his. "I don't know what comes next," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I'm done. I'm done with the lies. I'm done with you." The tension in the room was suffocating. Mark stood still, his fists clenched at his sides, every muscle in his body rigid. The weight of the truth hung heavy between him and Lynn, a gulf too vast to bridge with mere words. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. This was the moment he had dreaded and longed for in equal measure. Lynn stood across from him, her eyes wide with fear, but it wasn't just fear that reflected in her gaze. There was something else, guilt, regret, perhaps even sorrow, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing she said could change the reality of what she had done. "I know everything," Mark repeated, his voice low and steady, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "I know about Brian. I know about Ray. I know you were going to have me killed." Her face paled, the color draining from her cheeks. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. She took a step back as if she could retreat from the magnitude of what had been uncovered, but she couldn't. It was too late. "Why?" Mark asked, his voice cracking with the pain of the question. "Why did you do it, Lynn? Why did you betray me like this?" Lynn's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't answer him, not with words, not with excuses. There was nothing she could say that would make it right. "I don't know how it happened," Lynn whispered finally, her voice breaking. "I felt alone. I felt invisible. And then Brian came along, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I thought maybe this was the way out." Mark's chest tightened, the hurt overwhelming him. Alone? Invisible? He had worked his fingers to the bone for them, for their family, for her. And yet she had found comfort in another man's arms. She had chosen betrayal over honesty, lies over love. The weight of it crashed down on him, suffocating him. "Lynn, we could have fixed this," Mark said, his voice strained. "We could have worked through it, but you didn't even give me the chance. You didn't even try." The words hung in the air, heavy with the sting of truth. Lynn's tears fell freely now, her shoulders shaking as she took another step back. "I was scared," she admitted. "I didn't know how to fix it, Mark. I didn't know how to fix us." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, his mind reeling with the absurdity of it all. He had tried so hard. He had worked so much, not just for his job, but for them, his family. And now, standing in front of him, was a woman who had chosen to destroy that very foundation for what? For a fleeting moment of excitement? For something new? His fists clenched tighter. He was done. He couldn't keep fighting for a marriage where only one person was invested. He had been patient. He had been understanding. But Lynn had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "I loved you," Mark said quietly, the words almost a whisper. "And I trusted you with everything. But you took that trust and you shattered it." Lynn flinched as though his words had physically struck her. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. There was nothing she could say that would make it right. Mark could see the remorse in her eyes, but it was too late. "I thought you were the one person I could count on," Mark continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But now I know that was a lie." He shook his head, the bitterness rising in his throat. He had never imagined that it would end like this, that the woman who promised to stand by him through everything would be the one to bring him to his knees. "Mark, I'm sorry," Lynn whispered. But the apology was hollow, insincere. It was too little, too late. Mark didn't reply. He couldn't. The words had already been said, the betrayal, the pain, the anger. There was nothing left to discuss. Lynn had made her choice, and now he had to make his. "You've already made your decision," Mark said, his voice cold and final. "You've made your choice, Lynn. And now it's over." Lynn's face crumpled, the tears falling harder now, but Mark didn't move. He couldn't. He had to stay strong. He had to hold on to what little dignity was left in this broken marriage. "You're done," Mark repeated, his voice firm. "We're done." He turned and walked away, leaving Lynn standing in the silence of their shattered life. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The door clicked shut behind him, and in that instant, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He had finally confronted the woman he had loved, the woman who had broken him. And now, there was nothing left but the wreckage. The courtroom was a sea of faces, each one watching intently as the drama of Mark's life unfolded. The air was thick with tension as Lynn sat at the defendant's table, her face pale and drawn, her once pristine appearance now a stark contrast to the guilt that seemed to radiate from her. Beside her, her lawyer whispered quietly, but Lynn didn't seem to hear. She was lost in her own thoughts, trapped in the nightmare she had created. Mark sat on the other side of the room, his gaze fixed on Lynn, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had promised to stand by him forever, now stood in the dock, accused of conspiring to end his life. It felt like a surreal nightmare, one that he couldn't wake up from. The weight of it crushed him with every passing moment. The room was filled with people, but Mark felt alone, separated from everyone by an invisible wall. Lynn's eyes flickered briefly toward him, but she quickly looked away. She couldn't face him, not after everything she had done. But Mark wasn't sure if she was looking away because of shame or because she simply couldn't bear to face the reality of the destruction she had caused. The prosecutor's voice broke through the silence, his words clear and sharp as he began to outline the charges against Lynn. "The defendant, Lynn," he said, "hired a hitman to kill her husband, Mark, in cold blood, driven by her own selfish desires and a profound sense of betrayal. She colluded with an accomplice, Brian, and made arrangements for his murder." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. The reminder of what Lynn had planned, how she had plotted to end his life, was almost too much to bear. His fists clenched at his sides, his body stiffening as the emotions inside him threatened to explode. But he remained still, knowing that he needed to stay composed. This was his moment, the moment where the truth would finally come to light. The prosecutor continued, his voice growing more intense with each word. "We have concrete evidence, photos, messages, recorded conversations, that prove the defendant's intent. Her plans were deliberate, calculated, and heartless." Mark's heart sank. He had lived through this nightmare, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of so many people made it real in a way that nothing else had. He had always suspected the worst, but now the truth was undeniable. Lynn had wanted him dead, and worse, she had been willing to destroy everything they had built together just to get what she wanted. Lynn's lawyer stood up, attempting to defend her, but his voice faltered. He wasn't convincing. It was clear to everyone in the room that the evidence against her was overwhelming. She had no defense. She had tried to explain her actions, but nothing could justify what she had done. "The defendant was under emotional distress," the lawyer argued, his voice wavering. "She felt abandoned, trapped in a marriage that wasn't working. She was manipulated by her lover, Brian, and was not thinking clearly when she made these choices." The room was silent. Mark could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. They were all watching him, waiting to see how he would react. How would he handle this betrayal, this public humiliation? But Mark didn't feel humiliated. He felt nothing but a deep, bitter sense of loss. He had spent so many years trying to build a life with Lynn, trying to fix their marriage, but in the end, she had chosen to destroy everything. She had chosen betrayal over honesty, lies over love. Lynn turned her face slightly, her eyes locking with Mark's. For a brief moment there was a flicker of something, regret perhaps, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She couldn't hide from the truth any longer. The evidence was irrefutable. The prosecutor continued, bringing up the messages between Lynn and Brian, the plans they had made, and the phone calls that had been recorded. Mark could feel his chest tightening as the details of her betrayal were laid bare for everyone to see. She had been plotting his murder while pretending to be his loving wife. She had wanted to destroy everything they had, all because she was too selfish to face her own problems. And yet, in the back of his mind, Mark still heard her voice. "I didn't want this. I didn't know how to fix it. I was lost." The words replayed over and over in his head, and despite everything, a part of him still felt the ache of her pain. But it was nothing compared to the pain she had caused him. He had been ready to fight for their marriage, to try to fix what was broken, but she had given up. She'd chosen the easy way out, and now it was too late. The final argument was made. Lynn's fate was sealed. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but when they returned, it was with a verdict that was expected but still crushing to hear. "We find the defendant guilty," the foreman announced, his voice somber. Lynn's face went pale as the words sunk in. Mark felt no satisfaction in hearing them. There was no joy in knowing that justice had been done. His heart felt heavier than it ever had, the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on him. The judge pronounced the sentence, and Lynn was led away in handcuffs, her eyes briefly meeting Mark's once more. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He had finally gotten justice. But the price had been too high. Mark stood by the window, staring out at the familiar view, the same view he had gazed upon for years, thinking his life was secure, that everything was in place. But now, everything had changed. The woman he had once called his wife was gone. Not physically, not yet, but in every other way she was gone. And with her, the life they had built was shattered beyond repair. The courtroom verdict echoed in his mind. Guilty. It had felt like a weight lifted from his shoulders, but now, in the silence of his home, the feeling of emptiness only deepened. The house was too quiet, too still. The space that had once been filled with the noise of their children, the comfort of everyday life, now felt hollow, like a room stripped of all its warmth. Mark sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the mug in front of him. His hands were shaking, though he couldn't remember the last time he had felt so exhausted. The trial was over, Lynn was convicted, and she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. But the victory, if it could even be called that, felt meaningless. There was no joy in knowing that justice had been served. The damage had been done, and in the end, no sentence would ever bring back what was lost. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message from his lawyer reminding him to prepare for the next steps. The legal battles were far from over. There were financial matters to settle, custody arrangements to finalize, but none of it mattered to him. None of it could fill the void Lynn had left behind. As he read the message, his mind drifted back to the trial. Lynn's face had been so different when she took the stand. No longer the woman he had known, but someone entirely foreign. The tears she shed had been real, but they were not for him. They were for herself, for the life she had thrown away in pursuit of something fleeting. And when the verdict had been read, there had been no relief on her face, no sense of justice, only resignation. She knew what she had done. She knew the consequences. But it didn't seem to matter to her. She had already decided to abandon everything. Mark closed his eyes, trying to push the images from his mind. He didn't want to think about Lynn anymore. He didn't want to feel the weight of what had happened. But it was impossible to escape the constant reminder that everything they had shared had been a lie. A lie built on years of deceit, hidden beneath a facade of normalcy. His phone buzzed again, this time a message from his sister, offering her support. He read it, but the words didn't comfort him. He had no desire to talk, no desire to explain what had happened. How could he? How could anyone understand the depth of the pain that came with being betrayed by the one person who was supposed to love him the most? He stood up, pacing around the room. It had been weeks since the trial, and yet it felt like a lifetime. He hadn't slept properly since the day he found out about Lynn's affair. And now, even though the truth had been revealed, he still couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in this nightmare. How was he supposed to move on from this? How could he rebuild his life when everything he had known had been destroyed? The doorbell rang, breaking his reverie. He walked toward the door, unsure of who it could be. As he opened it, he was met with the sight of his 2 children standing there, their faces filled with concern. They had been staying with his parents for the past few days, trying to give him space to process everything. "Dad?" his daughter asked softly, her eyes searching his face for any sign that things were going to be okay. Mark smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, sweetheart, how are you?" "We're okay," she replied, stepping inside. "We've been talking about you. Mom, she said she's sorry. She said she didn't mean to hurt you." Mark's heart clenched at her words. He had heard Lynn's apology in the courtroom, but it hadn't felt real. How could it? She had said the words, but they were empty. They were nothing compared to the damage she had done. "I know," Mark said quietly, trying to hold it together for their sake. "But I'm okay now. I'm working on it." His son, a little younger than his sister, clung to his leg, looking up at him with wide eyes. "When is Mom coming home?" he asked, his voice small and full of confusion. Mark knelt down to his son's level, feeling the weight of his words. "Mom isn't coming home, buddy," he said gently. "She's gone for a while. But we'll be okay. We have each other." His son didn't understand, of course. He was too young to grasp the complexities of what had happened. But Mark saw the sadness in his eyes, and for a moment, the reality of it all hit him like a wave. His family was broken, and he couldn't fix it. The silence in the house was unbearable as they sat together, Mark trying to keep up a semblance of normalcy for their sake. He didn't know how to explain this to them, how to explain why their mother had abandoned them. He didn't know how to forgive her, how to reconcile the woman she had become with the woman he had loved. But as he looked at his children, he knew one thing: he would never give up on them. They were his reason for moving forward, for rebuilding what had been broken. Lynn might have destroyed everything, but he would not let her take them from him. What do you think of Lynn's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. From 0 to 10, what's your score for this shocking betrayal? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And make sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.